the breakout session here is we're going to be looking at a skills development in Gaelic Games. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Phil Kearney. Is a lecturer in motor skills acquisition, coaching and performance, and course director in MSc Applied Sports Coaching in the Department of Physical Education and Sports Sciences at the University of Limerick. Dr. Kearney's current research interests include maturation and youth sport, coaches' knowledge and practices, and enhancing practice equality. So before he begins, we're going to put up Mentimeter here as well. So if there's any questions that you would like to ask, we're going to have a panel discussion, just a Q&A at the end of that. So make sure you ask your questions to Dr. Phil Kearney now. So with that, please give him a warm round of applause.
Oh, click on. Did you mention me? Okay. So, you're very welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along to this session. It has been my privilege for the last couple of years to be exploring what is happening by way of skill acquisition and skill development within Gaelic Games, and to work with a great group of coaches and sports scientists to try and identify a framework to go forward for skill acquisition and skill development across all areas of the player pathway. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today and introduce you to what I hope will be the start of something really nice, really effective in terms of enhancing skill development for Gaelic Games. I need to thank, first of all, the people who were involved with me on the working group. You can see them here on the screen. Ed and Molly are with me, and they'll be coming up for some Q&A afterwards as well. But we have expertise in the group from coaching, but also from high-performance sport through to children's sport, child development, biomechanics. So across a wide range of areas relating to the development of skill, we got a working group together which did some fantastic work to produce what you're about to see. I also want to thank Aoife Lane and Martin Kennedy, Aoife as the head of the Sports Science Working Group, and Martin as well in terms of his liaison with us for the support and the leadership they provided all the way through this process. And I'd also just quickly like to acknowledge the fact that while this is a working group from us within Gaelic Games, this is informed and reviewed by experts from Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States. So there's a fantastic group have gone into informing and guiding what I'm going to present and what we're going to propose in terms of our framework document going forwards. So when we talk about skill acquisition and the development of skill, we first need to think about, well, what is it that we mean by skill? And for me, what you see happening on the screen now, that encapsulates what we really are after when we talk about skill. Within Gaelic Games, players are constantly posed with problems that they need to solve. For the player in possession, they have to decide, do I carry the ball? Do I shoot? Do I pass the ball? If I pass, who do I pass to and how? For their teammates, they are also solving problems. The problems of where do I move and how fast do I move? How do I time my run to be in just the right place at just the right time to create an option for my teammate? For defenders, we also have problems being posed. How do I tackle? Do I hold off? Do I shadow? Do I shepherd? All the time in Gaelic Games, players are being posed with problems that they need to solve. And that's what we want you to think of as skill. Skill is solving the problems that the moment presents. Solving the problems in attack and defense, solving the problem on the ball and off the ball, solving the problem as a teammate, as a defender, as an attacker. All of these problems are being posed, and skill is your ability to solve those problems. And skillful players are those who consistently solve the problem that the moment presents. And having this broader understanding of skill, what is it that a corner forward has to do? What is it that a wing back has to do? Understanding the problems that they face makes you think, how do I create more problem-solving players? And skill is the ability to solve those problems. If we take a closer look at Colm Cooper's actions just here, before he passes the ball in, what do you notice? For me, one of the most important aspects is the time that he has on the ball, the time that he creates on the ball, how he has patience. He uses a dummy solo to move the defenders in one direction so that he creates time not just for himself to see what's available, but time for his teammates to make a run to create an option for him. Skill is not just making a decision. It's not just an action that you perform, a one-off. We think about skill as an embedded cycle after cycle after cycle of reading the play and adjusting your action. Reading the play and adapting your movement. Reading the play and adapting your movement. So Colm Cooper is reading the play and moving the defenders, and reading the play and playing the pass. And his teammates are reading the play and moving to the right space, at the right time, at the right speed. As a Kerry man, I'm quite pleased that in this instance, Dublin defenders did not manage to read the play quite as well in order to solve the problems that they were presented. But the point we want to emphasize is that we need to think about skill not as an action that people perform, not as a one-off event, but as this constant cycle after cycle of reading the play and adapting your movement to solve the problem that the moment presents. And that's why we've got the Celtic cross symbol, or the Celtic knot symbol here, to illustrate that when we think about skill in this way, as cycles after cycles of being presented with a problem and solving that problem, then we think differently about how we develop skill in young people and in high-performance athletes, in fact, across the player performance pathway. What I've talked about so far in terms of reading the play and adapting your movement, that applies very much in open play, but the same thing applies whether you're taking a 65 or a sideline cut or a 45 or a free kick. You have to read the situation and adapt your movement in response. The best players are those who can read the situation, read the distance, read the angle, read the wind, read the lie, and adapt their movements to be successful on that attempt. Whether we're talking about open skills or closed skills, that same idea of skill as solving the problem the moment presents. Skillful players as those who can consistently solve the problem the moment presents, that applies. So our definition of skill as solving the problem the moment presents, as being able to read the situation and adapt your movement in response, that is what we are trying to develop. That is at the essence of what we are looking to develop with players at all levels of the pathway. And if that's what skill is, we now need to think about what skill acquisition is. So how do we enhance the development of adaptable problem solvers who can engage in these cycles of reading the play and adapting their movement, and reading the play and adapting their movement? Think about two players who go and attend two different training sessions. They both spend an hour at training, but they take very different amounts of learning from those two sessions. In one session, the coach has selected activities that meet the needs of the athlete. They challenge them just enough to enhance their learning. For the other athlete, for the other player, the activities are not quite right. In the first session, the coach has sequenced the activities so that the player sees the connection between them and can take the lessons from one activity into the next. In the other session, the sequence isn't quite right and the player doesn't quite get the connection. In the first session, the player delivers, or the coach delivers feedback to the players, which are the right level of feedback at the right moment for that player. In the second session, maybe the player doesn't get the feedback they need at the moment that they need. Two players have experienced an hour of practice each, but they've taken very different amounts of learning from those two sessions. And it's not just because of what the coach does. What the player does in a training session determines how much they learn from that session. What the player thinks about, how the player acts within a training session will determine how much they learn. Skill acquisition is the science of practice. It's 100 years worth of investigations into what makes a high-quality practice session. And how is it that coaches and players can adapt what they do in order to deliver the most learning so that players and coaches can make the most use of each hour of practice. I've said that there is some practice which is more effective than other types of practice, but it's also really important to stress that not all effective practice sessions look the same. We are not saying that all sessions should follow a specific template and be identical. There are many different ways in which you can challenge athletes at just the right level to enhance their learning. There are many different ways in which you can provide feedback to athletes which give them just the guidance that they need. So we are not advocating a one-size-fits-all in terms of coaching. Coaches have an enormous amount of choice in terms of how they design and deliver practice sessions. What's important for coaches is that they understand the different ways in which they can choose activities, sequence activities, deliver feedback to players to maximize their learning. There are many different ways to deliver effective practice session. So I'm saying there's no gold standard, and I don't want you thinking about a gold standard practice session. I want you thinking about a Goldilocks practice session. Because Goldilocks is looking for something that is just right. We get the most learning out of practice when the challenge level for the players is just right. I have seen practice sessions involving full games, and the players, they engage in the game, but it's too complex. They can't get the learning, they can't focus on the specific elements that they need to get enough learning out of that game. And so within Gaelic Games, we have this huge focus on modifying games and exaggerating elements of games, designing games so as to develop or to provide the right challenge for athletes. For anybody who listens to the Mike Quirk podcast, two excellent examples of how we do that, how we shape games to get the right challenge level for athletes, are provided by the episodes with Paddy Talley and Niall O'Mahony, talking about high-performance sport and talking about youth development sport. So there are examples about how we get the challenge just right. If the challenge is too high, we don't see enough learning. Equally, if the challenge is too low, we don't see learning. I've seen practice sessions, shooting practice sessions, where players are scoring 80, 90% of the shots that they take. These players don't shoot 80 to 90% success within a game situation. Now, there may be a situation where you want players to get comfort reps or confidence reps, but that wasn't the aim in this session. The aim was to improve their shooting, and yet they were scoring 80, 90%. What that tells me is that the challenge wasn't high enough. They weren't attempting shots that they would attempt in game situations, or they weren't attempting shots that were under difficult enough conditions to provide a challenge for them to learn. Quality practice is about getting the level of challenge just right for the players that we meet. And if we get the level of challenge just right, we get players who are engaged, players who are motivated and investing in practice. And players who are engaged and investing in practice are those who are motivated to continue to learn. I've said that there are many different ways in which you can deliver an effective practice session. There is no one way, there is no gold standard, there's no one template that we want everyone to follow. But that doesn't mean that anything goes. That doesn't mean that you can do any combination of activities or provide feedback in any way. There absolutely are effective ways to practice. Any teacher in the room, any parent of a child who's gone through some examinations recently would be familiar with the idea that reading a page over and over and over again is a very poor use of your time when you're studying. Much better ways to practice, to study, Read the page, flip it over, and see how much you can recall. Read the page, look at the examples, and then try and come up with your own examples. There are effective ways to spend your hour of studying, and there are effective ways to spend your hour of practice. And what we're trying to do in the framework that we're proposing is to identify what those effective ways of spending that hour of practice are. And the key to that is getting that challenge just right. So, how do we know that we've got the practice session just right? How do we know that we've got the challenge just right? I'm going to give you a maths test. I saw the enthusiasm, so I'm going to give you 2 maths tests. Here's the first one. You're going to get 4 questions. I want you to do the multiplication in your head. I want you to see how many answers you can get right. You'll have about 3 seconds per question, and then the next one will appear on screen. 4 questions. Let's see how many you can get out of 4. Are you ready? Here we go. So that's test 1. I could hear the concentration in the room. I could hear a couple of rusty gears turning from people who hadn't done maths in a while. Let's give you a second test. Same idea. 4 questions, 3 seconds each. How many can you get right? Two tests. Was one of those easier than the other? Did you get more questions right? We'll get onto that in a little bit. For many people in the room, one of those tests will be easier than the other. You may have been more successful in one and less successful in the other. You may have felt and found it much easier in one than the other. You may have been much faster. How fast were you answering the last question on the right? How fast were you answering the last question on the left? What we know from the research and skill acquisition is that it is very easy to artificially boost how well somebody is performing on any task. We get you to do the same thing over and over again, we can boost your performance. We give you lots and lots of feedback, we can boost your performance. But the other thing we know from that 100 years of research and skill acquisition is that we are not interested in temporarily boosting your performance. We are interested in learning. Effective practice is practice which boosts your learning. So we need to understand, how do we measure learning? We need to understand that how well players are performing within the drills that we see, within the games that they play in the practice, how well they're performing in the moment doesn't tell us much about what they're learning. To understand how much we're learning, we need to see how much they retain. We need to get them to do the same activity again at the start of the next session. We need to get them to play a game and see, do we see those activities coming up in the game? One of the coaches that I worked with talked about how he loved this particular set of activities. He thought they were great. He thought the players got loads of time out of them. The players looked really good doing them, but he doesn't do them anymore because he never saw any of those performances transfer over into the game. There are many ways to practice effectively, and it'll depend on your context. How do you know if your practice is effective? Well, you won't see any temporary boost in performance. You'll see it retained by the players on the next game and on the next match that they play. Now, I've talked a lot about performance so far, and you might think that this emphasis on improving a player's performance level, making sure that they're performing the skills well, is all about the development of higher and higher level players. It isn't. Skill acquisition has as much to offer the coach who's wondering, how do I help this player who is struggling to make contact with the ball? How do I help this player who's lagging behind the rest in the group? The science of skill acquisition is as important to help everyone develop a basic skill as it is to enhance high-level performance. You can see this in one of the participants from the Gaelic from Girls program, talking about how it was her developing skill that really enhanced her enjoyment in the sport. And we know this from countless studies in countless sports and countless countries, including the youth participation study from the GAA. One of the elements that keeps people involved in sport is feeling competent, feeling like they're good at what they're doing, feeling like they are improving. And so skill acquisition is one of the vehicles that we have to help coaches work with those struggling athletes, to help them enhance their skill, to help them feel like they're competent and feel like they are improving. There was an excellent piece of research earlier this year from Gymnastics Ireland, and they talked about keeping teenage girls in sport with moments of pride. And I love the phrase. How can you facilitate teenage girls feeling moments of pride? Moments of pride from being able to perform the skills, moments of pride in the improvements that they have made in their skill set. The science of skill acquisition allows us to help players continue to develop, to help keep them in the sport. For older teenagers, the story is a little bit different. One of the interesting things that we find is older teenagers often report a frustration with their coaches. The coaches can help them with the basic skills, but they want to keep progressing. They want to keep developing. And the coaches haven't the skill set to allow them to do that. So skill acquisition is equally important to allow coaches of older teenagers understand, okay, how do I keep progressing the skill levels across the board of the athletes that we're dealing with? So all I've talked about so far in terms of quality practice, in terms of paying attention to whether you're seeing learning, is a call to get serious about practice. But inspired by some of what you might have seen earlier today from Salisbury Rovers, it's really important not to get too serious about practice. As Jarlath Burns said this morning, there's space for ladybirds too. And this is, again, backed up by the research. Now, there's not as much research within Gaelic Games, but in soccer, the research is very clear. When you look at academy players, 16, 17 years of age, some of whom get selected to the next level and some of whom get released, one of the consistent differences between those players who continue in the sport, who are offered a professional contract, is that they have spent more time playing the game. That play is mostly in the form of informal games, back garden games, schoolyard games. So no parent supervision, no coach supervision, informal get-together games. Think about that for a moment. At 18 years of age, one of the things that decides your future is how much you played between 6 and 12. Now, increasingly, there are fewer and fewer opportunities for children to engage in that kind of play. So then the question becomes, well, for coaches, how can we bring that informal play into our sessions as much as possible between the ages of 6 and 12? Whether it's small-sided games, lopsided games, but what can we do to encourage that emphasis on just playing the sport? I'm talking about this body of science called skill acquisition, but the person who is going to use this body of research, use these lessons to design their practice activities, to give more effective feedback, that person is you as the coach. Skill acquisition is a body of guidance, of research, of ideas that informs coaches about how they can be more effective, whether their goal is to sustain participation or to develop high performers, whether they're working with children or high-performance adult athletes. there are lessons in the science of skill acquisition that you can use to make your life easier, to make you more successful in what you're trying to achieve. And one of the things that was most pleasing for me over the course of developing this resource was seeing how many examples of good practice are already out there at club level within Gaelic Games. So whether they're examples of children being introduced to skills in such a way that they have to read what the opponent is doing and adapt their movements in response. Again, that problem-solving element. How do we get across the line? Thomas Cronin at the Piercing in Limerick. How do we introduce children to fundamental movement skills in a way that is engaging and fun and developmental? There are magnificent examples out there of how coaches are already practicing in a way that is aligned with these guidance from the science of skill acquisition. So the resources are there for us to use. And I can only talk about a few principles today, but the framework that we've put together, the guidance booklet that we've put together, which will be shortly released, can provide you with assistance in all of these different areas in terms of skill development. Not just in the short-term development of skill that I've talked about with better session design, better session sequencing, better feedback within sessions, but also in the long-term journey of a player from 6 to 26 and beyond. So we hope that people will find lots of lessons within this framework that inspire them to explore further areas of their practice. We haven't just described those principles in the booklet, we also have a host of resources in there as well. So if you are coaching teenage girls and you're interested in creating a really vibrant environment for them, Sarah Kelleher's resource, a webinar, freely available, has got fantastic guidance. Are you coaching children on the basics, the fundamentals of their movement? Move Well resource is linked and is a fantastic resource. Do you like reading popular science books? Mark Williams' book is a fantastic introduction to a wide range of skill acquisition topics. So part of what we do in the framework is give you some principles. Part of what we do is direct you to further principles. But we don't have all the answers. That's why we're called scientists. If we had all the answers, we'd be called sages and we'd make an awful lot more money. But we're scientists because we are intrigued and we are always learning about how do we do things better. And we are always looking for partners in terms of how we do that. So again, another example from what we met over the course of our time preparing this. Some of you may be familiar with this book. All of you who are coaching would be familiar with the challenge. How do you coach the individual in a team sport? How do you give them enough time? So this book is packed full of ideas from a practical coaching perspective about how you can enhance the individual coaching within a team sport context. And over the course of the early part of this year, I had the pleasure of working with Pat Ranahan, who's a former Limerick footballer, who did his master's research, starting with understanding how expert coaches coach the individual in team sport, then running a workshop for youth sport coaches, for Gaelic Games coaches within the club. How can they do this better? Guiding them for 8 weeks as they reflected on their practice, and at the end of it, leaving them with a system to help them as a club better coach the individuals within the team sport setting. We don't have all the answers yet, but we are partnering with coaches. There is already examples of really excellent practice out there which can provide guidance to your future practice. So this is the framework for skill acquisition, which contains the ideas and the principles that I talked about, which contains guidance across all levels of the pathway, and which I hope you will find useful and stimulating and the start of a journey to enhance the development of skill and to help you develop skill with all of the young people that you're working with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timothy. Yep. Not the red chair. Not the red chair, that's my chair. Thank you, Phil. Really enlightening there. Thank you so much for all that information, and I know for a lot of people found that very, very useful. We're going to do a very short Q&A now, and again, we've menti.com up there. If you'd like to put in your questions to our panel, we'd love to be fit to ask and engage with some of those questions for you. So Phil's going to join us here. I'm also going to ask Molly Dunne as well, who is a former Galway camogie player. She spent 10 years playing for her county. Following her retirement, she made a successful transition herself to coaching, helping Offaly club St. Ryan's to consecutive All-Ireland Intermediate Camogie titles, and she also coached the Galway Intermediate Camogie team, the All-Ireland Glory, in 2022. This year she's involved with Salthill Knocknacarra Camogie team, and she works as a sport officer with Galway ATU, and she participated in the GAA Female Coach Mentorship Programme overseen by Cleona O'Connor recently. So give her a big round of applause. And Ed's like, just introduce me as Ed. So Ed, who was with us here earlier, please welcome back Dr. Ed Coughlan, who of course is a sports scientist with DCU before specialising in the concept deliberate practice in PhD at Liverpool. And he is now a senior lecturer in skill acquisition and coaching science at Munster Technological University in Cork. So give him a warm round of applause as well. So we're going to get straight into questions. Because I know we don't have much time, but just very briefly, something that struck me, Phil, that you were talking about there is becoming a skill for a player. As coaches, some players, you see them and, you know, they're so skillful, they read the game, they're excellent, but how do we as coaches help players to become more skillful?
So, in many, many ways, and in different ways for different players. I think I'm going to challenge a little bit of that question. We see some players and they are incredibly skillful, but they don't always start like that. Sometimes some of the players who go on to be some of the most skillful players did not have a great start to the sport. They developed that over the course of their practice. For some players, they were not even that interested in the sport, and we've got examples of that within the guide. And it's only at some stage through their development, something happened, they saw some game, they encountered some coach, and a spark was lit within them in terms of developing skill. And so part of it for me is, can we light that spark for players that they can see how they can develop, they can see the possibility to improve? I think that's a really important part. I think a second part is skillful coaches who are purposeful in the design of the activities that they use, who are purposeful in the feedback that they provide, again, giving players the opportunity to develop skill. And the third part, which I referenced briefly, is just opportunities to play the game. One of the things that the research suggests very clearly is that players who are more creative, they have a history of spending more time playing the game.
Okay. Just looking at some of the questions here, thank you for your engagement here. So what about the coaches that say their players are not skillful enough to play the game and focus on drills all the time? Molly, would you like to take that one? Yeah,
I suppose, and like my background is, I'm not a sports scientist, but I'm an on-the-ground coach that has progressed up through the pathway. And I've seen firsthand the benefit of applying skills acquisition to my coaching. When Phil contacted me about being part of this working group, I was like, I'm not a sports scientist. But when he understood how I was coaching, he was like, you're applying skill acquisition on the ground every day. And I think if a player is not skillful, I think we first have to look at ourselves as coaches. And are we allowing them the opportunity to perform those skills at training that we expect them to perform in a game? So very simply, if I want to be able, and Phil talked about that shooting practice, uncontested shooting practice, and that's important that we work on the skill over time, but really being exposed to that environment where you're taking that shot under pressure, where there's someone coming at my right side, someone chasing me down. Even if you're doing that in a non-contact but in a shadowing environment, that's enhancing that skill even more. And I suppose, as first of all, always as coaches, it's more important that we look at ourselves and we ask ourselves, are we creating the environment to allow that player to develop that skill? And I suppose if we're not, that's our job to find a way in our training sessions to make sure that we are creating those opportunities and they are getting the benefit to improve those skills.
Okay, let's look at.
Could I,
oh yeah, Philip.
just to react to one bit in that statement as well, because there was kind of this idea of, there's drills and there's games. I think one of the messages that we want to get away from is that, there are not two types of practice activities. There's not a game. There are so many different forms of games that you can use, from some quite simplified basic games, gradually developing to some much more complex games. And when people talk about drills, actually, even though people use the word drills, what I see them deliver on the pitch is not one thing. There's a wide range of levels of complexity. And what some people will call a drill, others will call a simplified game, and there's an enormous amount of crossover. So I think it's not helpful to talk about drills versus games. I think it's important to understand, no, actually, what are the 20 different activities, from simple to more complex, that I could present for these players? And if you have an understanding of the full way in which you can layer up the complexity of practice, then you've got a much better chance of meeting the specific needs of your players.
Ed, I'll get you this. So how do we keep the skillful players engaged and keep developing them at a session where the level of group aren't in the same skill set as these players?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. It's something that we're asked a lot, actually, when there's some clubs who are maybe a small club and they don't have an opportunity to have multiple teams and so on and so forth, but even clubs that do but want to keep them together, that mixed ability. And I think it goes back to something that Phil said there about being able to find that right challenge for what they're doing. So you might set up a game or a scenario for kids, and for some kids that game is going to be easy. So your job as a coach there is to provide them with something else to hold their attention. Is there a rule that you can put on them? Is there a constraint that you can put in insofar as, let's say, the part of the pitch that they play in, the people that they're going to bring into the game? And we see this even from the very highest level of sport. Michael Jordan, who a lot of people would know in here, one of the greatest basketball players of all time, was a brilliant player in the Chicago Bulls long before Phil Jackson came along as a coach. But Phil Jackson said, Michael, you're amazing, but until you bring others into the game, we're winning nothing. You've got to, I want to use the fact that you see the game differently to everyone else, maybe that's ever played the game up until that point, to actually bring others into the game. I would take that principle all the way back to younger kids, a precocious kid who might have an older sister, an older brother who, they've been hanging out with since they were dot. And all of a sudden they're just used to playing with older kids, which maybe developed them a little earlier. Well, what can they bring to the session that can have an impact in others? It doesn't need to be the same game for all of them, but what our job is to try and can we get it to the same challenge for all of them that are involved? And I think that's how you can answer that question. And to be able to step back and be, okay, that child is not being challenged enough in this game, but I want them to play together. My job is, how can I adapt what they're engaging with so that they also find a challenge in what they're doing?
Another question here, Phil. General advice is not to stream at Go games, but stronger players can dominate to the detriment of weaker players. Discuss.
So I'm smiling because you're trying to keep this on time. And this is a question that can have us here all night.
We're not allowed to be here all night.
So I think this is an incredibly important question. I think it's one of the questions that certainly Ed and myself get asked probably more than any other in the last 6 weeks. And Kieran Kilkenny, who's working in Mayo, is doing some research at the moment around this topic in particular. I'll maybe start and I'll pass over to the others that they might want to add on to this. I think it's, first of all, very important to understand what we mean by streaming. So streaming does not mean that the best 10 players get a football each on the best pitch, under the lights, with 5 coaches, each of whom have been doing CPD for the last 20 years and 20 years experience, and the bottom 10 kids in the group get a corner of the car park with a parent who's just come along and 1 football. That's not what is meant by streaming. The idea behind streaming is that you provide an experience that challenges each child appropriate to their needs. And you are providing the resources equivalent for each group and appropriate for each group. And so in the first instance, I think one of the problems that we see around streaming is that people misunderstand what streaming is and they do something incorrect with it. The second thing I will say around streaming and mixed ability is that teachers have been debating this question for 100 years. And do you want to know what the answer is? They're still fighting over it. But one of the things we definitely know is that teaching a mixed ability classroom, differentiating your instruction, is one of the things that teachers, as professionals, find very difficult. So if we are going to ask volunteer coaches to teach mixed ability groups, we need to be supporting them to do that. I think that we should be exploring the benefits that come from mixed ability, because I think there are enormous, short-term and long-term. I think that we should be, first of all, though, better understanding what we mean by ability grouping, what do we mean by streaming, mixed ability, what are the challenges? And Kieran, we're looking forward to seeing what you do on that.
Just maybe to come in on a kind of a practical example in relation to that, and I think it's something anyone that's involved at that level in clubs has probably come across. And we would have had that issue in our own club recently. And it goes back to the point Ed made about having a challenge appropriate for that player. So, for example, the really strong player, okay, the challenge for you in this game of Go Games is how many times can you pass it to maybe a certain weaker player? And the challenge for that weaker player is how many I want you to maybe have 10 contacts on that ball. That's your challenge now for this Go game. So it's setting different challenges within the game that will challenge the player to the level they're at, and maybe even recognising, I suppose, in subtly bringing in that teamwork, that just because that player is much better than the other, they can still play a really important role together as a team.
Final question. You talk about feedback, Ed. How do you give it individually or a group, or as a group?
Carefully. I think, and where possible, without emotion coming into it, so that you really modulate yourself when you are providing feedback, so they're not receiving feedback from you, but your behavior is telling them you're not happy about something. That you're actually truly engaged in, this is what I've seen, but I'd like to know what you've experienced. So I'm going to try and ask you questions about what has happened out there before I come in with a bulldozer and tell you what I've seen and what you've done, and I'm now going to fix you because I'm the coach. And I think, does it differ in different environments? Of course it does. If I'm in a training session on a Tuesday evening, 6 to 7 with the 10, 11-year-olds, that's very different to feedback on Saturday with the 10, 11-year-olds when they're in a game environment. But I'm still going to try and ensure that I'm asking them, first of all, what they're experiencing before I come in with what I think, from my perspective, which is completely different from what theirs is. So, again, individually and as a group, I would do it in both ways, because when you do it to a group, it doesn't apply to everyone. So I think if it is something applicable to a group, something tactically, something that we're trying to work on as a group, maybe it's in line with, again, back to David Sharkey's work, if it's in line with a theme we had for the season, then absolutely I'm giving that to the group. However, if it's something for an individual that is specific to maybe a challenge that has been set for them, then again, I will engage just individually with them, but I'll try and do it from a place of, what is it you're experiencing? Because maybe they're about to figure out what it is you think they haven't figured out yet. And I'm going to be really careful not to jump in and they haven't gotten it yet, I'm going to get in there and fix it. Maybe they're actually just about to, and maybe I might disrupt that. So I'll try and find out where they're coming from first before I think I'm coming in with my pearls of wisdom.
Yeah, okay. Really good advice there and really good engagement. Thank you so much for being with us on the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, show your appreciation once more, please, for Ed, Molly.